Hello, my name's Philip Smith, and I'm a volunteer researcher for a charity called Scotland's Garden and Landscape Heritage. I've been working with other volunteers on the Glorious Gardens of East Lothian project, and I'd like to talk about that today. The project aims to research and record significant gardens and designed landscapes. It's being led by Scotland's Garden and Landscape Heritage in partnership with Archaeology Scotland and East Lothian Council. Ultimately, the aim is to update and enhance local and national historic records, expanding the existing inventory of designed landscapes. Between 2014 and 2017, we successfully completed the first phase of a project to record non-inventory designed landscapes in Falkirk and the Clyde and Avon valleys. Examples of the completed reports can be viewed on www.sglh.org. We have now turned our attention to East Lothian, and volunteers are working in small teams under expert supervision to conduct the initial research on 60 out of a total of 120 sites. Much of the work is desk-based, but visits to sites are also an important element. Today, by way of example, I'd like to present on some of the work our teams completed on one site, the Smeaton estate. Smeaton's located just outside East Lothian, next to Preston Kirk. According to a plaque in the churchyard, the name Smeaton means settlement of the Smiths. Its history can be traced back to documents in the 12th century, but details are vague. However, we do know that since the 16th century, it's been owned by just 3 families. In this presentation, we will show how we have researched the families that own Smeaton, its development over time, and the historic features that remain today. Now, I know that the Hollywood fans amongst you would pronounce this Hepburn, but the correct pronunciation for the first family is Hebburn. They were a Northumbrian family that had established several branches in East Lothian by the 15th century. The Smeaton-Hebburn branch commenced with the grant of Smeaton to Adair Map by his father in 1538. Adam supported Mary Queen of Scots and fought at the Battle of Langside. And the picture on the right here shows a monument to the Battle of Langside in Glasgow today. That battle was shortly before Mary's flight to England. The National Museum of Scotland website has a letter from Queen Mary to Adam at this time, with a modern audio recording in the Scots language, and it's well worth looking up. Adam's son Patrick was a magistrate in Haddington and served on a commission investigating the supply of shoes in the town. His son John served on a committee for purging the army in 1640 during the Civil Wars. John's son Patrick allegedly served in an inquest overseeing a witch trial, although I've not seen any independent evidence to verify that claim. He died without issue, and inheritance went to his nephew, also Patrick. The younger Patrick had several children. 2 of them inherited before dying without living children, and so inheritance went to his daughter's son, George Buchan, who adopted the new name Buchan-Hepburns. While we have evidence of the Smeaton-Hepburns service as magistrates and committee members, we have less documentary evidence on how much they invested in the landscape of Smeaton. However, we can get some clues by consulting old maps. This map by Pont and Hondius, available on the National Library of Scotland website, was published in 1630, the year that Patrick the shoe investigator died and John the army purger took over. It's probably the earliest map we have that includes Smeaton. It shows its location, north of the Tyne and Limtyne Briggs, west of Tinningham. The map hints at Smeaton's appearance, probably a tower house, although that may be a formulaic depiction, since virtually all the houses look the same on this map. In any event, it seems to show an unremarkable building in a landscape bereft of trees apart from Pencraig. This map, by Adair, was published in 1682, a few years after Patrick, the nephew of the alleged witch hunter, took over. It shows slightly more detail than the previous map. Smeaton is located adjacent to Drylaw Hill and directly north of Preston Kirk. To the north lies Newbythe, and to the east lies Tinningham. Smeaton is now portrayed as a building surrounded by trees, which is modest in comparison to Newbythe and Tinningham, but significant in comparison to some neighbouring houses. The previous map had very few trees in it, but I don't think we can conclude that the trees on the 1682 map were necessarily planted between 1630 and 1682. It might just be a stylistic difference between the two map makers. Having said that, George Buchan-Hepburns later wrote that the enclosure movement in East Lothian began with the Duke of Lauderdale building a stone enclosure at Lennoxlove to impress James, Duke of York. Now, James became king in 1685, shortly after this map was published. So perhaps the trees around Smeaton might indicate some early experimentation in new farming techniques, maybe following the examples of nearby Newbythe and Tinningham. This excerpt from A Guide to the Roads of Scotland gives us another perspective on what the estate looked like around the time that George Buchan-Hepburns inherited it. On this map, north is to the left. We see a west-facing country house with a distinctive ring of trees, and more open parkland between the house and the river. Were the trees part of an agricultural scheme, or was it merely ornamental? George Buchan-Hepburns was admitted to the Faculty of Advocates in 1763. Later he became Solicitor to the Lords of Succession, Judge of the High Court of Admiralty in Scotland, a Baron of the Exchequer and a Director of the Royal Bank of Scotland, and he became a baronet in 1815. Despite all of that, he's best known as an enthusiastic agricultural reformer, writing A General View of the Agriculture and Rural Economy in East Lothian in 1796. He advocated hollow drains, deep ploughing with oxen, not horses, tills, frequent fallow, early sowing, and new crops such as Swedish turnips. Some of the drains through the farm may date from this time. It's largely to him that we owe much of the designed landscape today. George built the new mansion house, pictured here, the Steading and the walled garden, all fit for a man of his status, as well as experimenting with new agricultural techniques. However, we should give credit also to his second wife, Margaretta Henrietta. She had been careless enough to be widowed twice, both times by senior army officers, and brought a fortune of £24,000 to Smeaton, which must have been handy for financing the estate, as well as helping to pay off Smeaton estate debts that George had inherited. Margaretta Henrietta married George Buchan-Hepburns in 1781, and the wall garden was built the following year. The debts were paid off in 1789 and the new house built in 1793. Work on Smeaton Lake commenced before 1825, probably while Sir John was the laird. Sir Thomas, his son, did substantial tree planting, and it's to him that we owe the Arboretum. He was also a keen curler and developed the lake as a curling pond. Thomas's son, Archibald, credited his father with the creation of the lake and the Arboretum. Archibald was a keen horticulturalist. He wrote a book on botanical expeditions to Africa in the 1900s. He also had significant dealings with the Royal Botanical Garden, Edinburgh, both sending and receiving new seeds and plants. Archibald died in 1929, and the family sold the estate a few years later. In passing, it's worth mentioning Archibald's sister Agnes, who married into the MacDowell family in Galloway, and with her sons was the founder of the garden now known as Logan Botanical Garden. When Smeaton came up for sale, John Rennie Gray acquired it with a view to restoration. However, he died shortly afterwards, and the house sat unused until the Second World War, when it accommodated evacuees. Afterwards, the mansion, seriously damaged by both damp and the wartime residents, was demolished. The estate was split between John's children, Gladys and George. Gladys took Drylaw and George took Smeaton Preston Mains. George served on multiple agricultural bodies, and in recognition of his leadership, he received the OBE. In the second half of the 20th century, in line with modern practice, the Greys enlarged some of the fields, removing hedges and roads, as well as converting some parkland to agricultural use. The main picture here looks towards Preston Mains over a field that was enlarged by converting parkland to cultivation. They also changed the use of the South Park and Rockery by installing the equestrian course. But they encouraged extensive planting and conservation in the remaining ornamental areas. 2 years after the flooding of 1948, the Greys gifted Preston Mill to the National Trust. They recently joined the National Tree Collections for Scotland. They have achieved remarkable continuity over 88 years, while ensuring that the farm stays abreast of new farming developments. That balance will be ever more important in the future. So that's a brief summary of the families that have owned Smeaton. Obviously, they had a major influence on the designed landscape we enjoy today. Next, we'll go on to look at development of the estate over time. Map regression is a technique used to do this. Estate boundaries have changed over time due to purchases, disposals, inheritances, changes of use, and even, it's been suggested, games of cards. Today, the Smeaton Preston Mains estate is primarily agricultural and covers much more than the ornamental areas around the lake, walled garden, and site of the mansion, but my main focus is on the latter areas. If we look at Roy's map on the left, we can see much more detail than we saw on earlier maps. Smeaton seems to consist of 3 fields, bordered by hedges or wind shelters, and with what looks like an avenue or possibly an orchard in the middle field. There's an avenue along the top here, and access seems to be from the east via a road which comes from Preston Kirk, south of Mains, up the east of Smeaton, and then on towards Newbythe, and there are fields heading towards Newbythe. The old house may have been somewhere along the northern drive. There are some flaws in this map. For example, there's no indication of the hilly or rocky areas on the estate. If we now turn to Forrest's map on the right, we can roughly see the 3 fields, 1, 2, 3, but this time they're in a sort of trapezoid shape, and that takes account of the fact that there's rocky ground in the west. So this is an improvement on Roy's map in terms of accuracy. But we can also see that new structures have been built, the walled garden and the mansion to its west, and a new drive has been driven from the south, affording access to the house from that direction. And the old path network from Preston Kirk past Preston Mains looks much more formal and resembles the modern road layout today. We can conclude that the new house, walled garden, and south drive were built between 1747 and 1802, consistent with what we already knew from historical sources, while the hedge system around the borders of Smeaton dates back at least to the first half of the 18th century, suggesting that the Buchan-Hepburns were indeed adopters of new agricultural techniques. However, the house doesn't look very much like the photographs we have for the mansion, and the Steading is not included in Forrest's map. We're grateful to the Gray family for sharing the 1820 estate map shown on the left. It gives great detail on the extent of the estate at that time, stretching from Drylaw in the west to Knowes in the east, actually off the end of this map, and from Preston Mill in the south up to Newbythe to the north of the estate. It shows the footprint of the mansion house in a form and shape that we recognise today from photographs and plans. It shows the south drive heading up from Preston Kirk towards the house. In addition, it's the earliest map we have seen to include the Steading building here, north of the walled garden. Given its omission in Forrest's map of 1802, this may suggest that the current listing designation of the Steading as mid to late 18th century should be reconsidered. There's a feature to the west of the estate that might be wetland, and there seems to be a stream with trees on either side running from it. Preston Mains is also depicted in some detail with outbuildings and an orchard. The map on the right comes from a map of the county of Haddington and is less detailed than Dickinson's. It shows the parkland extending to the bottom of the walled garden, which is consistent with Dickinson's map, showing the parkland here in line with the walled garden. It's also the earliest map to include a definitive picture of a lake, just above the word hill, the body of water. There's some confusion about the date that the lake was created. Sir Archibald attributed the creation of the pleasure grounds and policies to his father, Sir Thomas, who didn't become laird until 1833. However, he explained in a speech that the lake was built in phases. The eastern part was dealt with early in the 19th century, before the western part was cleaned out in 1830. So we might speculate that the 1825 map shows a pond created by drainage of boggy land, which was later developed into an ornamental lake and a curling pond. Sir Thomas, who was a member of the Oregon Society, which collected North American tree species, then started the Arboretum. The 1854 Ordnance Survey map brought a new standard in terms of accuracy, especially the 6-inch editions like these ones. We can still see the trapezoid shape of the boundary hedges, helpfully labelled Old Fence, which probably confirms that they are the original hedges. And we can see various built structures such as the walled garden, the steading, and the house. But we can now also see other details, such as the gradual disappearance of the northern drive as we proceed towards the west. It seems to peter out. We can see the full extent of the lake and the trees around it. And details such as the ice house, which is possibly hard to see here, but it sits just behind the steading. In addition, while it's hard to make out in this slide, there's a lot of detail of planting within the walled garden. So I've got it in an inset here, which is probably still difficult to see, so I will expand that. So this map gives a nice detail of the layout of planting within the walled garden at the time. It might just be a kitchen garden, but the layout looks like there might have been formal gardens in the north of the walled garden, and perhaps also in the southern section. However, when Patrick Neal visited in 1812, he did not mention any ornamental planting. He described the walled garden as containing 142 feet of glass with 2 late peach houses and a greenhouse with vines. Apple varieties were sourced from Normandy and America, and pears from the Channel Islands. It is worth mentioning, whilst we're looking at this exploded inset, that there seems to be quite a lot of ornamental planting along the western wall of the walled garden at this stage, and some ornamental or some pleasure paths going through it, and then the haw-haw proceeding to the west. But going back to the fuller maps, if we turn to the 1908 map on the right, the general layout seems to be the same, but there are some changes. The path to Colside, which was shown in the middle of the field to the north in 1854, no longer exists. This path may once have been the drive to the original house. Based upon Hepburn family records, local historian David Affleck refers to the old house being 300 yards north of the new mansion, which would put it roughly in this area, or here. Meanwhile, there's been new planting of trees in the 1908 map on the southern boundary and to the east of the wall garden in Steading. And the southern parkland in both of these maps has expanded into the field to the south and is no longer aligned with the wall garden. So it's down here instead of up here. The northern section of the wall garden looks like orchard in the 1908 map. It's not clear what's in the southern section, but it may have been a conifer nursery at this time. The 1948 version on the left was surveyed in 1938, so it gives a reasonable picture of what the estate looked like shortly after its acquisition by the Greys in 1934. There's not much difference between this map and the 1908 version, perhaps indicating that Sir Archibald Buchan-Hepburn, who died in 1929, was keen to conserve the estate as he found it. Although he was very active on the horticultural side, Royal Botanical Garden of Edinburgh records show substantial numbers of seeds being delivered to and from Smeaton in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For example, in 1897, Sir Archibald donated seeds from Georgia and Turkmenistan to the Royal Botanics, and in 1911, the Botanics Outdoor Department received several consignments of Wilson's Chinese seeds from Sir Archibald. Ernest Henry Chinese Wilson was a celebrated pioneering horticulturalist who embarked on several expeditions to China around this time. Looking at the 1957 map on the right, the obvious change is that the mansion is no longer there. It should be actually in this area here. It had been empty since it was sold, and after accommodating war evacuees, it was demolished in 1949 or shortly afterwards. However, the path network that used to run through the parkland to the south of the house is still there in this map. A less obvious change is the division of the estate between Drylaw and Smeaton Preston Mains. Other changes include significant tree felling on the southern boundary compared to the previous map and to the northwest. Given the date range here, it's likely to be related at least in part to wartime demand for timber. The Greys have also told us that some trees were felled east of Coldside, perhaps here. Other war-related developments included an outstation for auxiliary forces to resist invasion, located somewhere to the west of the South Drive. The road to Coldside is now shown in the woods that adjoin the East Service Drive here. Before looking at surviving features in detail, it's worth considering a few changes in the landscape since the 1957 Ordnance Survey map. Firstly, the parkland area to the north and south of the site of the mansion has receded. In the north, the middle section of the old northern avenue and hedge has been subsumed into the field north of the site of the house. In the south, the boundary has now receded back in line with the end of the wall garden. Meanwhile, some land to the east of the main drive here has been sold off for development as the Dean, and the field to the east, which used to be split into two by a road north of Preston Mains, is now one field since that road has disappeared. As noted earlier, these changes were all made by the Greys as they modernised the farm to make it more efficient. So like George Buchan-Hepburn before them, and possibly the Smeaton Hepburns before him, they were introducing new techniques for efficiency which had an impact on the designed landscape. In the following slides, I will summarise remaining features under the themes shown here. Elements of the original roads documented by William Roy and William Forrest still exist. The Northern Avenue continues in its eastern section, shown in the photograph in the top centre. In the middle and western sections of that avenue have been turned over to agriculture, with only one or two stranded mature trees from the old hedge remaining in the field, pictured on the bottom centre. The original house, predating the mansions, thought to have been situated around here. The southern drive and traces of the turning point outside the mansion house still remain. Mature trees still line this road, for example the lime trees pictured on the left, although some have been lost to storms. A drive down the east of the walled garden towards Preston Mains is still there, forming a private drive to Smeaton House. A road north from Preston Mains through the fields has disappeared, although some stranded trees, remnants of hedges which once bordered the road, remain there as well. It's still possible to see the pattern of hedges depicted by Roy and Forrest, particularly in the east of the estate, shown here in yellow, although some of these may have been cleared and then replanted. For example, the hedges along the eastern service drive now consist mainly of hawthorn, rhododendron and sycamore, number 1. That's also the case for the northwestern boundary hedge, number 2, which grows in the same footprint as the hedge in Roy's map and performs an important function as a shelter belt, but does not have the diverse range of species that one might expect. Contrast this with the hedge or shelter belt to the southeast of Caldside, number 3, and along the eastern boundary hedge, number 4. These have a very diverse range of trees and shrubs, suggesting relatively long, undisturbed presence since the days of Forrest and Roy. It's also worth mentioning that, while some hedges have been lost, new plantations have been added, such as the wood situated just above the number 5 on the map on the right. The northern part of the walled garden remains intact and is publicly accessible as it's run as a nursery and cafe. Most of this section contains nursery plants and trees. There's a large shed containing garden accessories and a glasshouse for young plants. Behind the shed, there are some remnants of the orchard that was shown on Ordnance survey maps from 1908 onwards, pictured on the right. There are also old apple trees along the interior wall of the northern section. The cafe and a small gallery are located in a modern conversion of the buildings towards the middle of the walled garden, sometimes called the Apple Store. The gallery has an interesting horseshoe-shaped entrance door. The cafe has access to 2 small garden areas to its north. To the south of the cafe and gallery is a small private garden. It contains a pedestal which once held a listed sundial dated 1690, stolen in the 1990s. This is perhaps a hint that there was an earlier garden here before the construction of the walled garden in 1782. The mansion was demolished in 1949 and nothing remains of it now but a faint trace of the turning circle to its front, visible from some satellite pictures, a set of steps associated with the haw-haw in the Parkland, a remnant of the eastern part of the haw-haw, and a fragment of the east wing of the mansion, which was converted into an electricity house. See centre bottom here. Caldside is a listed building consisting of 2 adjoined cottages, and it remains to the north of the estate, pictured here on the right. And we've included this excellent painting by J. Walsh in 1892 for comparison purposes. The gatehouse, built at the same time as the mansion, still exists at the entrance to the South Drive, although it has a modern extension. It's also listed. The head gardener's house, situated to the east of the walled garden, was refurbished and renamed Smeaton House in the early 1960s. A ruined barn to the north of the main South Drive, visible on the 1820 estate map, has been converted to a house called the Lambing Shed, and it's now a private residence. The log cabin is still located south of the lake. There are also 2 residences within the Steading building. The remains of the Steading consist of an east wing and a west wing, with a northern section and a central section. The east wing of the Steading is listed as mid to late 18th century, although the map regression suggests it may be early 19th century because its first appearance in maps seems to be in Dickinson's map of 1820. The Steading accommodated estate workers and also provided storage for carts and grain. Today there are some residences and some small units for crafts or businesses. The remains of the ice house are located slightly to the west of the west range of the Steading, within a hedged enclosure adjoining the Steading. This feature does not appear to be listed. The earliest map reference we have seen is the 1854 Ordnance Survey map. The date of the ice house is unknown. The lake and surrounding Arboretum are perhaps the highlight of the estate today. Smeaton recently joined the National Tree Collections of Scotland, established by the Forestry Commission and the Royal Botanical Garden of Edinburgh, to raise awareness of Scotland's tree collections and protect and enhance them for the future. According to a tree survey in 1999, the estate identified around 50 rhododendrons, mostly differing species and including relatively uncommon Indian varieties as well as Chinese. Around 200 conifers outside the walled garden and 30 within it, again largely differing species. And around 250 broad-leaved trees, with a further 75 trees remaining to be recorded. The Buchan-Hepburns sourced exotic specimens from all over the world and built an important collection. While at least one rhododendron on the above survey dated from 1793, generally the oldest exotics seem to date from the 1840s, providing evidence that Sir Thomas was largely responsible for planting them. But Sir Archibald also did significant planting, and the Greys continued planting after they acquired the estate. Sir Thomas was credited for the first introduction of at least 2 species, including Sequoia sempervirens, coastal redwood. Horticultural experts have identified rare specimens of rhododendrons, conifers and broadleaf species on the estate. Several surveys have been performed and many trees have labels such as the one pictured, King Boris fir, which attracted my attention for some reason. But it's not clear that we have a comprehensive record. Parts of the estate are overgrown, making it difficult to access all trees, and in addition, storms have had an impact, albeit fortunately not as catastrophic as some other East Lothian sites. As noted earlier, the area of Parkland contracted to make way for enlarged agricultural fields in the late 20th century. However, the remaining parkland still has many old specimens, such as the one pictured on the left, growing in the northern parkland. The challenge for conservation is how to replace these aging trees when they fall over. When the mansion house was there, it would have had magnificent views to the south, over the Tyne Valley towards the Lammermuirs and Traplain Law. As we have seen, the extent of the parkland and density of trees growing there fluctuated over time. Today there are fewer trees since some specimens have been lost, and some land has been converted to agriculture. But the view from the top of the ridge is probably close to what it would have been in the heyday of the mansion. The situation is similar when we look north towards Berwick Law. At one time there were tennis courts roughly where the overflow car park is today, next to the North Park. While on the east of the South Park, there was a rockery and stones can still be seen there today. We have taken a whistle-stop tour of the families that own Smeaton, the development of the site over time, and the features that we can still see today. I hope you found it interesting. The next step will be to submit all this information to a landscape expert for assessment. Without preempting that, I would suggest that we might have some tentative conclusions. Thinking back to the Adair and Roy maps, they portrayed trees and hedges, suggesting possible involvement by the Smeaton Hepburns in new farming techniques in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. George Buchan-Hepburn wrote about many improvements he was working on, and he built the walled garden. George Gray won the OBE for services to agriculture, while the Greys enlarged some fields and modernised the farm. Early evidence for ornamental gardens might include the avenue or orchard in Roy's map, as well as a sundial from 1690. The Buchan-Hepburns built the lake and planted the exotic trees, as well as working with the Royal Botanical Garden of Edinburgh. And the Greys continued new planting and have joined the National Tree Collection of Scotland. We have looked at the hedges that seem to have survived from the early 17th century, and we've identified some areas where dates or designations might be reconsidered. I think the sites made an important contribution to Scottish horticulture, in part because of the actions of the people who lived there, but also because of the legacy of unusual or rare plants that's been left. But of course, older specimens will inevitably die, and it will be important to keep investing in new ones in an evolving landscape. Most of the information we gathered to complete this work is publicly available, although it's not always easy to obtain, and it comes from diverse sources. In this slide, we've tried to show the main sources we consulted. Our thanks go in particular to the Gray family, who were generous with their time and assistance, but of course we thank all those who have helped us with this research. There was a lot of desk work, but site visits are vital too. In addition, some interesting information is simply not available in digital form, so we had to visit a number of libraries and archives. We work in teams to complete standard templates when doing these reviews, and we've done one for Smeaton. It'll be assessed by a landscape expert to determine the significance of Smeaton as a designed landscape, and potentially they will add Smeaton to the database of significant designed landscapes. Either way, the template will be published on the charity's website, along with all the other sites we're looking at. I hope we have made life easier for people working on the next stage of the project, but also for anyone else with an interest in Smeaton. I've personally learned a lot about this wonderful site, in fact, much more than we were able to record on the template. And whilst working on the project, I've met a lot of very friendly and helpful people. I've enjoyed working in Smeaton, but I'm already working on the next challenge, as we have 120 sites to review in total. If you found this interesting, think you would enjoy volunteering to work in one of our teams, and have some time to spare, why not contact us? You don't need to have a lot of expertise in history or gardens, although both would help. You'd work in a team, and guidance material would be provided to help you. There's a fair amount of desk work, so computer literacy would be useful. Mainly though, you just need to be curious and motivated to find out more. With 120 sites to review, we need your help. Contact us at development@archaeologyscotland.org.uk. Thank you.